Can you hide me from my daddy? It was 2 in the morning when the little voice cut through the garage. Thin, urgent, the kind of voice that made engines sound suddenly like a threat. Under the fluorescent bulbs, among rows of parked motorcycles and a wall of jackets heavy with history, a 6-year-old girl stood clutching a pink backpack so tight her knuckles went white. Her name was Emma. The men who called that place a clubhouse were older than her teachers, more scarred than her cartoons, and for a moment they froze like anyone would when a child appears where she clearly shouldn't. Leather rustled. A radio played low and useless. Someone lit a cigarette and then thought better of it. Razer, the man others called Mr. Rodriguez, was the first to move. He was the kind of man who kept his voice small, because shouting filled the air with danger. He crouched until his face was level with hers. His hands were big and warm, the kind that could have broken things, but instead closed around a matchstick pretend moment. His fingers gentled her grip on the backpack strap. "What happened, sweetheart?" he asked. His voice had a way of smoothing the edges of people. Emma didn't look like a kid who expected that kind of softness. She looked like a kid who'd practiced being invisible and had failed. She fumbled the zipper, small fingers trembling, and as it opened, she pulled out 3 objects. A kitchen knife with a darkened smear at the base of its blade. A compact digital camera streaked with fingerprints and glitter of months' worth of snapshots. And a Hello Kitty keychain that hid a tiny flash drive. For a breath, the room forgot how to breathe. The biker's eyes tracked every small thing. The worn strap of the backpack, the way Emma's lip quivered, the knife that no 6-year-old should know the purpose of beyond cutting sandwiches. Then someone, Chains, the team's enforcer, spoke without anger, because anger was a tool he used only when other tools failed. "Where's your dad, baby?" Emma swallowed. Her voice was flat and small. "He hit me. He said not to tell. I took pictures. I took the thing that has the videos. He'll come back tonight." Silence layered itself in the garage. The soundtrack shifted. A distant train, the thunk of a toolbox lid, the almost inaudible way Razer's jaw moved as he thought. These were men many had judged at a glance and been wrong about. For years, they'd worn reputations like armor. Now that armor felt strangely inadequate. One of them, Doc, reached for the camera with respectful gloves, not to gawk, but to preserve what truth it contained. They passed the objects like carriers of a fragile, explosive secret. Nobody asked how a child had learned to make evidence. The fact sat between them like a lit fuse. If you're following Emma's story, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The headlights came first, thin beams cutting the night like eyes. 3 cars rolled up the drive and parked a little too close.
The air tightened again. Men climbed out. A man Emma called her father, taller and more weathered than she needed. 2 others with shoulders the size of coffins, carrying the kind of silence that said trouble. They didn't look like they were making small talk. "Give it to me," the father barked before he was close, a voice that had been practiced in fear and given back with cruelty. "Give me the bag." Razer stood up slow, that old settler steadiness settling over him. He stepped between the child and the men. "She's with us now," he said. "You don't get to scare her." The father's eyes flicked past Razer to the cluster of tough-looking men leaning against their bikes. "You think you can hide her from me? You think—" He never finished. For 20 heartbeats the scene compressed. A challenge, a refusal, and then movements so quick it felt like the night had learned to breathe faster. The bikers moved with an economy that looked like chaos to anyone who'd never seen them before. Zip ties flashed in hands. A grunt, a thud, the sharp sound of someone losing balance. A muffled sound, and a man's knees folding like rope. It was over in less than 90 seconds, and yet the air kept remembering it. No one narrated the actions. They were not heroes on a movie screen. They were flawed people, doing a thing their conscience told them must be done. They didn't boast about the takedown afterward. They only checked that Emma was safe, that she had her backpack still, that her tiny chest was moving. Emma, still small and steady, had found the gun as it fell and handed it to Razer without looking at him, like she had been taught to treat dangerous things as evidence. The sirens arrived a beat later, closer than they dared hope. Police cars spun lights into the wet pavement. The men, the father and his 2 associates, were taken away. Charges were read, cuffs clicked. Official language slid over the raw edges of what had happened. The bikers explained their role. The evidence was catalogued. Photographs, the flash drive, the knife, the recovered weapon. No one pretended the legal system would move like lightning just because this night felt urgent. They simply handed over what they had. When the social worker arrived a few hours later, her name was Margaret Stevens, and her posture said she had to believe the world would not come to pieces on her watch. She carried forms, pens with government logos, and a professional skepticism that had softened over years into a practical tenderness. Seeing Emma huddled on a plaid jacket among the chrome and grease, she hesitated for the first time that night. "This is not a childcare setting," Margaret said. She said it like both a statement and a plea. The club was not designed for children. It was made for brothers in arms, for mechanics, for nights when men hid from their problems by working on things that had nothing to do with their hearts. Razer looked at Margaret and told her 2 words she would remember.
She's staying. Margaret's professional training recoiled at the notion. The state rarely greenlit informal guardianship for a child. And Razer's past carried red flags papers didn't forget. Backgrounds, parole records, rumors, everything in her job book pointed to a slow legal process. But she also watched Emma rest her head against Chain's calloused arm and felt the small size of the girl's hand against a much older thumb. Emma's breath evened. A blanket was draped over little legs. Someone tucked in a teddy bear, and for once the garage did not smell like oil and old smoke. It smelled like an attempt at home. The following weeks were awkward and patient. Bikers who spent their lives handling metal and engines learned to read feverish foreheads and soothe shudders in a child's sleep. They learned the right words to say at the moment nightmares climbed back into the room. Words that did not plaster over fear, but let it be named and then put away. Chains read picture books with dramatic voices. Snake made a ritual of tucking a blanket around Emma's knees and telling her small, grounded truths about stars and mothers who loved children even when they were far away. Tank, who had a way of breaking into a grin over the smallest victories, braided Emma's hair the first time she let him try, even though his hands trembled with inexperience. These were not transformations captured by a single shot. They were small accumulations. Emma began to sleep without jerking awake. She stopped flinching every time a door opened. At school, she held her pencil with a steadier hand. At home, if a pimply, fluorescent-lit garage can be called that, she painted. She taped a child's drawing to the tool wall. A pink house, stick figures around it, the sun smiling down, as if nothing could topple the scene. The bikers mounted the drawing like a trophy. It was both fragile and enormous. Margaret visited often, at first to fulfill her duties, and later because she wanted to see if these rough men were really making space for a child. Professional caution softened into a curiosity that sometimes felt like hope. She monitored records, arranged schooling, and shepherded the early paperwork that would become a custody case. There were obstacles. The state had procedures for a reason. Children needed stable homes vetted by background checks, and the label outlaw did not make that checklist. Friends in social services warned her, Recommending custody to an ex-con with a criminal past would be professional suicide. But Margaret also saw Emma in the morning light, hair mussed, hugging Razer's knee, and muttering things only a child's developing trust could produce. She watched Razer attend parenting classes with the clumsy humility of a man learning what he'd never been taught. He learned to make oatmeal, to tie tiny shoes, to sing silly songs low so they didn't throw off the man's sense of dignity.
The bikers took steps to reduce the state's concerns. They submitted to background checks. They agreed to supervised visits with family members. They cleaned the garage of dangerous items and created a small, guarded room painted soft green where Emma could feel safe. They met with law enforcement and with social workers, answering questions honestly even when answers were uncomfortable. When the day came for the custody hearing, the courtroom felt smaller than everyone pretended it would be. Men in crisp suits shuffled papers. Cameras were not allowed in, but whispers moved like wind. The prosecution framed a narrative steeped in risk. A child should not be in the care of people with criminal histories, no matter how sincere. The defense, modest in resources but fierce in intent, laid out the evidence of what Emma had endured and the daily work these men had done to give her a life worth staying in. Emma was called to the stand. She climbed up and sat carefully, hands folded, and looked at the judge as if she were reading the face of a person who could change everything. "Who do you live with?" the judge asked simply, not to test her, but to let truth speak. Emma's answer was a child's ledger of feeling. "I live with Razer and Chains and Snake and Tank. They make me food and check my sleeping. I don't get scared there. He used to hit me, and now he doesn't." Her voice was not theatrical. It was plain, almost logistical. She named Razer Daddy in the quiet of the courtroom, not as a replacement, but as an adoption of safety. "Razer is my daddy now," she said, and the room did not know whether to laugh in relief or to weep. Margaret, called as a witness, was precise and unexpectedly human. She recounted timelines, medical reports, school notes, and the gradual evidence of recovery. She spoke of nights she'd spent watching Razer soothe a crime child, and of the bikers' compliance with social work interventions. "It's not that they are perfect," she told the judge. "It's that they have become what this child needed to survive." The legal system is built on risk and precedent, on statutes and history. The judge, Patricia Williams, a woman with decades of family law behind her, listened like someone who had spent a career balancing what the law said with what a child required. She read the room and the records, weighed the danger the father presented, and considered whether the men who took a stand in a garage had done so out of impulse or responsibility. Her ruling was careful and deliberate. Custody, on behalf of the state, must always consider the child's best interest. Razer was granted legal guardianship under strict conditions, ongoing supervision by social services, mandatory parenting classes, and cooperation with local authorities. The decision did not erase past record. It carved out a future with guardrails. In the gallery, the bikers let out the breath they had been holding for months. Razer's face, usually composed, softened until it broke in a wet grin. Emma ran into his arms like a tiny storm, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself be held completely. That victory, however, did not close the story. It opened 100 small tasks and a new way of living. The bikers converted the back room into a space with safety locks, alphabet posters, and a couch that doubled as a crash pad for nights the child woke terrified. They installed shelves with storybooks and labeled bins for crayons instead of tools. They learned how to talk to teachers and to answer a school nurse's questions without defensiveness. They made a rule. If anyone in the community knew a child was in danger, they would act, but they would also report, document, and cooperate. They formalized what had been instinctual into practice. Razer and his crew started a grassroots initiative they named Little Warriors. The name came from a short exchange. Emma once drew a picture of a knight in pink armor and called it her warrior self. The bikers liked the contradiction: rugged men protecting tender children. And the name stuck. Little Warriors began modestly. Local kids from unstable homes were brought in for hot meals, homework help, and the sort of supervision that fused tough accountability with care. The bikers created a protocol that worked with police and social services, handing off evidence, supporting families who wanted help, and offering shelter in moments of absolute danger. Margaret advised them, careful to ensure compliance with the law and to mitigate liability. The first summer the program ran, 32 children cycled through the clubhouse for workshops on safety, art, and self-expression. The bikers learned CPR not as a badge, but as a necessity. They created pledge boards where they signed their names to promises about check-ins and background checks. Police officers who had once regarded the group with cold suspicion slowly became allies, drawn by the program's transparency and the bikers' willingness to be accountable. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid eye contact began to wave and to drop off meals. Emma watched the clubhouse change the way a child watches a garden grow. She saw chains of adults transform into scaffolding for children. She grew from a 6-year-old who could scarcely trust to a 10-year-old who wanted to protect others. She started a small routine. Before school, she zipped her pink backpack, now faded at the corners, and tucked into a side pocket a laminated card with 3 emergency numbers and a drawing of a smiling sun. The Hello Kitty flash drive that had once contained proof of her wounds lived in a locked file drawer at the sheriff's office. It had done its job as witness and was now symbolic of the small bravery that started everything. Emma's school performance improved. She made a friend who liked dinosaurs, another who liked to mix paints until the colors became storms.
She told stories in class about being brave. In child language, "My daddy fixes bikes, and he also makes pancakes." Teachers noted a steadiness in her that hadn't been there before. She joined a Junior Explorer program and announced during a community fair that when she was older she wanted to be a police officer. "So I can help kids not be scared," she declared. And people who had once doubted the bikers' earnestness felt something like conviction. Years did not erase damage, but they made space for repair. The bikers continued to show up at parent-teacher conferences, at counseling appointments, at court dates for other kids in their care. Chains learned to braid hair in an expert, proud way. Doc trained as a volunteer crisis counselor and took calls at odd hours. The clubhouse, always a symbol of rebellion, became a strange sort of refuge, a place where misshapen lives learned to be right-sized for community. There were consequences along the way. Not everyone agreed with Margaret's recommendation. There were protests from those who believed children belonged only in conventional homes. Bureaucrats delayed certain approvals. A few old friends of the bikers pulled away, convinced the group had softened into something less honorable. But more people came forward, neighbors, teachers, even a few ex-officers, offering support and testimony about the work being done. Emma grew into the artifacts of her life. Her pink backpack lasted until it frayed into a thinner, crinkled thing that kept colors from bleeding like stubborn hope. She added new items to it, a set of crayons, a small notebook for notes she didn't always show anyone, a photograph of Razer with a wink that said, "You're safe." She still kept one item she never talked about much in public, a simple charm, the Hello Kitty keychain, now attached to a necklace Razer gave her on her 8th birthday. It was a talisman not of trauma, but of victory, a reminder that truth, when collected and trusted, can change the course of a life. The story of Emma and the bikers spread quietly at first, through whispered neighborhood conversations and charitable grant applications, then more loudly when the Little Warriors program began partnering with local shelters. People were moved by the image of scarred men learning to tuck a child into bed. They were drawn by the paradox of guardians who the world had once written off. They were, perhaps most of all, changed by the simple fact that a child had walked into a garage at 2 in the morning and been seen. No part of the narrative was clean. The men who protected Emma did not erase their pasts, and the law did not pretend they had. But something pragmatic and humane happened. A community claimed responsibility. Where systems had gaps, ordinary people, unexpected protectors, flawed but loving, showed up in ways that forced the system to listen.
The bikers' actions were not presented as a template or a lawless recommendation. They became evidence that people can change and communities can be reimagined when compassion is coupled with accountability. There were moments of quiet, too. Razer would sit on the porch of the now child-proofed clubhouse and watch Emma practice cartwheels in the yard and say nothing. Chains would hum softly the lullaby he'd made up the night she first slept through till morning. Margaret would sometimes bring a thermos of tea and sit with them, a bridge between statutes and human need, and they would talk about policies and pancakes and what it meant to keep a child safe. By the time Emma turned 10, she had a map of safety in her head. She knew who to call, where to go, and how to ask for help. She had a voice that was steady enough to be heard in a courthouse and bright enough to be funny at dinner. She had friends and a program that supported kids like her. She also had wounds that required attention and people who helped her tend to them without flinching. The flash drive remained an artifact of miracle and evidence. Its contents had been handled by authorities. It had played a role in indictments and a case that unfolded slowly, not as a single lightning bolt, but as a sequence of legal steps. The court's work continued in paperwork and parole reviews, in counseling appointments and safety plans. The bikers cooperated with authorities at every turn, aware that custody had been a legal gift with oversight attached. They did not celebrate extrajudicial action. They acknowledged it as an emergency response followed by the hard work of legality and healing. The last image of Emma at 10 is small and precise. She sat on a low stoop in the late afternoon, her pink backpack leaning against her knees, sunlight painting the zipper gold. She held a crayon in one hand and a laminated safety card in the other. Her face was turned toward a horizon that had once felt like an unreachable shape. "When I grow up," she told Razer as he lowered himself beside her, "I want to make sure kids know how to tell the truth." Razer smiled, something raw and honest, and answered, "Then we'll help you." If Emma's story moved you, subscribe for more real stories of unexpected heroes. And check the links below for resources to report child abuse and get help. There are hotlines and organizations ready to listen and act. If you or someone you know is in danger, please reach out. What shocked everyone that night wasn't just the knife or the flash drive. It was a child small enough to be held who chose against every fear to carry proof and walk into a room that had once been written off as dangerous. That courage set off a chain that remade lives. In the end, the pink backpack carried more than objects. It carried a turning point. It showed that protection can arrive from places people least expect, and that a community, even one made of unlikely guardians, can learn to become the safest place a child will ever know.